Thanks, Beth. Again, yeah, my name is Megan. I am a remote sensing ecologist at the University of Washington, and what that really means is I study ecological patterns and processes remotely from satellite imagery, aerial imagery, drone imagery, that kind of thing. I'm working with an incredible team led by Rebecca McGaffrey from the USGS and made up of a bunch of diverse scientists from the USGS, as well as 2 students from the University of Washington, Lindsay Skidmore and Medha Kumar. I also want to mention that we're working with National Park Service staff across Glacier National Park, Olympic, and Mount Rainier. But for this project, I'm actually going to focus most of my talk on work we've done in Mount Rainier. And for that, I really have to thank Beth Fallon and Rebecca Lofgren for their help. Okay, next slide. All right, so as Beth said, we're focused on alpine and subalpine meadows. These are considered vulnerable ecosystems that are sensitive to changes in temperature and precipitation. And we've been seeing a lot of that quite lately. And they're key habitats for a diverse range of species. Within the national parks, these are sentinel sites. They have long-term data available on wildlife populations, species populations. And there's a lot of management questions that we're really interested in informing and asking. And these are places that are valued by visitors. They're special spots. Next slide. So our team, led by Rebecca McGaffrey, is interested in this question of how snowpack has changed and water availability has changed, as well as how that has led to changes in vegetation and meadow composition, which in turn impacts wildlife populations. So all of us within our team represent one of these circles, really looking at how we can understand how all these changes are ultimately, if you can hit the next, impacting wildlife species. That's everything from like marmots, cascade fox, butterflies, insects, and they're seeing their habitat change. Specifically, related to this talk, we can see the change in meadow extent getting smaller, and gaps, which had normally been open, within the forest canopy starting to fill in. Okay, next slide. So my specific role in this process and in this project is to focus on the remote sensing components, to develop methods to get at better maps of meadow extent that we can then scale to look at meadow habitat across the Cascades into the Olympics and also into the Rockies. We're also looking at quantifying long-term changes in meadow habitat, specifically looking at tree encroachment and that loss of meadow habitat. And then as well, we're looking at quantifying long-term changes in phenology, sort of the patterns of green up, flowering, and changes in that kind of greenness and wetness in meadows, not within 1 or 2 years, but across the satellite archive of 40 years. For this talk, I'm just going to focus on that middle point, looking at long-term changes in meadow habitat due to tree encroachment. We can go to the next slide. Great. So this is a photo taken in 1929 behind what doesn't exist at the time, the Visitor Center in Paradise. And you can see, in this photo that it's a pretty open meadow habitat, specifically looking at that green arrow. But if we go to the next slide, and this is one taken in 1992 from a slightly different angle, we can see that same area is starting to fill in with small trees encroaching in that space. If we go to the next slide in 2023, more recent color photo, we can see that the trees are growing very slowly, but they're starting to fill in. And indeed, we're seeing a quite significant shift in that open meadow habitat. Okay, if we go one more slide. Generally, when we think of areas like the subalpine and alpine meadows, we think that loss of extent is due to tree encroachment, which occurs because of reduction in snowpack, more snow-free days, which allows trees to get a foothold and have more growing days to kind of expand and fill in. Next slide. But the challenge is, you know, if you talk to most park staff, they will agree. A lot of them have been, you know, working for the parks for a long time, and they've seen these changes themselves. They know where a lot of the encroachment is happening, but it's been very difficult to quantify meadow loss or tree encroachment, and to see where it's happening and how fast, at what rate it is occurring. And this is where satellite imagery and remote sensing can play a pretty significant role. Okay, next slide. The challenge is, you know, in aerial imagery, we can see this encroachment happening. We can identify those small trees moving in. This is that same area we were looking at earlier in Paradise, and kind of you can see that area of trees. You know, you can see that there's smaller trees as well. If you look at the size of the shadows compared to some of the larger tree structures around it. And so we know that these are smaller trees. But the problem is we don't have really good aerial imagery going back as far. And so it's difficult to do some sort of statistical comparison. So if you go one more slide, it's kind of just an example of this. This is an imagery from the 1950s. It's a black and white image. We can see that it's generally more open, but it's hard to map individual trees and quantify that change. There's also a lot of image distortion that makes things for remote sensing scientists get a little frustrated. Next slide. Now, the wonderful thing about satellite imagery is it goes back to 1984. It has more, a lot of spectral bands, which gives us a lot of information used to identify features, but it's at a much coarser resolution, making it difficult to resolve individual trees. You know, you can see here that the pixel sizes are much coarser. These are 30 by 30 meter pixels. So that's been a big limitation at using satellite imagery. Although we have a long archive, it's hard to, you know, see that tree encroachment. Trees grow pretty slowly. They come in, they're very small in size once they establish. So that's been a bit of a challenge. Next slide. So the method that I have been using or applying is called spectral mixture analysis. And without going into all the details, essentially what this method does is use the spectral signature of features of interest, water, vegetation, trees, and how it absorbs and reflects light from the sun. It gives us unique spectral signature, which we can use to model those coarser mixed satellite pixels to get at the fractional cover of each of the features of interest within each coarse pixel, you know, in that lower left-hand side. If you hit the next one, what we get from this process of modeling is an estimate of the fractional cover per pixel. Okay, next slide. This is a useful statistical technique that we can use where we can't necessarily resolve individual trees. We can use this approach to look at the fractional cover from early satellite imagery and compare it to recent satellite imagery to look at the changes in trees, meadow, water, and bare earth. And this is what we've done here. Next slide. So again, just caveat, these are very preliminary results. If you hit the next slide, you'll see that this is the meadow extent and fractional cover for 1984 with that dark teal, meaning there's higher meadow extent. You can see it's pretty extensive around the park. If you go to the next slide, you should be able to see a decrease in that meadow extent. This is from 2023. So a loss in not just meadow, open meadow habitat, but a lot of those gaps within the canopy or the forest are being less open and starting to fill in. Okay, hit next. We can use this information and to look at how much meadows have been lost within individual catchments, realizing that some catchments have lost a lot of their meadow habitat. And next slide, or just hit the next. I probably won't have time to focus on these areas given I'm running out of time. But if you hit the next, overall what we're seeing is about a 28% since 1984 in existing meadow habitat, including those gaps. But hit next one more time. Sorry for who's ever doing this for me, I thank you. But this is a big caveat. We haven't calibrated it, we haven't validated it, meaning that we, that number could be a little high. Once we calibrate it, it could come down. But regardless, this is a very significant number. This is a lot of meadow loss that's occurring. And I think that's a story that maybe gets hidden. We talk a lot about glacier loss, we talk a lot about snow, but we're not talking about the fact that a lot of these meadow habitats are shrinking in size. Okay, next slide. I think I might have to, and hit next again, kind of run through these examples quickly. Beth, I might just go to our summary slide if because I think I'm run out of time, but this kind of shows an example of that meadow loss for a specific area. Thanks. Yep, just keep kind of cycling through. You can see these examples. Happy to answer more questions if there are any. I just want to pause really quick here to say that what we're doing as a next step is connecting this to specific species habitat. This is an Olympic National Park looking at marmot habitat. All of those dots represent marmot populations, and looking at changes in meadow extent. The red meaning there's a lot of meadow extent loss, blue meaning there's some gain in meadows. I think if we talk to park staff, this really aligns with a lot of what I've heard from them. Is a significant amount of meadow loss, which does impact species. Okay, next slide. And we'll just kind of keep going to the next one. 10 minutes went really fast, apologies. Yeah, we're looking at wetlands as well. But I just want to give a little plug that this is really just getting started, and we're really trying to put all these pieces together. The next piece we'll be looking at specific wildlife and insect populations over time, and understand how these changes in meadow extent have influenced the changes in populations of different species. Our goal is to scale this up to Mount Rainier, Olympic Glacier, and then eventually the code and methods are available to look at meadows more extensively across the West. I do just want to mention one last thing as we go to the next slide, that I think one of the, one more slide. One of the kind of key pieces that I do want to mention, especially with the work I've done with Beth, is that while we see a lot of these meadow extent changing, the meadow composition changing, and that can be quite a, like as we look forward, that is going to increase. We also have to consider kind of compounding effects and looking at other things like social trails and how these meadows that, do remain maybe having other compounding effects that are influencing the health of meadows that need to be considered even more importantly than before. Yep, I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Megan. That was really, really great and really interesting start to the whole session. Does anyone, I think we have time for at least one question. Does anyone have any? We have one in the chat. Are there any restoration options for reducing tree encroachment into meadows?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a question more for the National Park Service. In other lower elevation areas or other landowners, they do like prescribed fire or tree removal, but I think in the parks there may be more limitations. Beth, maybe you want to answer that.
That's actually is maybe a good segue into the next talk where Madeline will be discussing that a little bit. And then, yeah, there's for any follow-up questions, I think you can put them in the chat and then maybe Megan can review them there. And Megan put her email in the chat, so feel free to follow up on that. That's really exciting research that I think will help us anchor also a lot of the rest of this work.